Today we're talking with Sondra Baras, who is the leader of the Christian Friends of Israeli Communities, an organization which is assisting and facilitating the development of Israeli communities in Judea and Samaria, a partner of Christians for Israel, and we support the work of CFOIC. Welcome to Sondra. How are you, Sondra?
I'm great. How are you, Andrew?
Good. So listen, I just wanted to have a chat with you today, Sondra, about this whole issue of applying Israeli sovereignty to Judea and Samaria, or parts of Judea and Samaria. Now, recently, as we all know, leading up to the Israeli elections and beyond, Bibi Netanyahu promised or pledged or said he would apply Israeli law and jurisdiction to Israeli settlements and the Jordan Valley. Now, that seems to be off the table at the moment, but I'm just interested if you can tell us a little bit about why would Israel do that? What does it mean to be applying Israeli law and jurisdiction to these territories? Is this annexation? Is it not annexation? What is actually happening?
Okay, so first of all, I'll start with the last question. Is this annexation? One of the problems with the word annexation is that it generally implies that you're annexing something that doesn't belong to you and creating a new reality. Whereas in the case of applying sovereignty in Judea and Samaria, what we are trying to do is create a legal reality that actually reflects both the reality on the ground in place and reflects the historical justice having to do with the area itself. And I think, if you ask me why I think it's so important to apply sovereignty, is because I think it's the right thing to do. First of all, Christians and Jews both share a faith in the Bible. So from a biblical, spiritual point of view, this land is not only part of the land of Israel that God promised to the Jewish people, but it's the center, very heartland of that land. It's actually the very place where God first made this promise to Abraham is in the middle of this area, in Samaria, at the Oak of Moreh. And many, many more examples that I can give to show how central this part of Israel is biblically to the Jewish people. It's also central historically. And at no time in history was this area of Judea and Samaria separated from the rest of Israel, with the exception of 19 years between 1948 and 1967, where that area was seized in an unprovoked act of war by Jordan. And they annexed the area, and their annexation of their area was never recognized in any international forum. In fact, there were only 2 countries in the world who recognized Jordan's claim to that land. I can go back to documents dating back to World War I and the San Remo Treaty and the documents, international legal documents, just after that time, that set aside the land of Israel for the Jewish people to establish a Jewish homeland, included Judea and Samaria. So from a legal point of view, this area has been set aside for a Jewish state in the same way that Tel Aviv or the Galilee or the Negev is part of the Jewish state. And it's only because the Arabs invaded and attacked Israel in 1948 that they even have any basis for a claim. And it seems a little odd to me to justify a claim to land for a group of people who started a war in order to take that land. It certainly doesn't make sense. It's not just, it's not right. So from all these perspectives, whether it's legal, historical, biblical, we have a right to that land. When we captured that land in 1967, again, as a result of a war that was forced upon us, Jordan attacked us from that area. We had every right at that point to, right then and there, apply sovereignty to that area. And in fact, Israel did apply its sovereignty to Jerusalem at that time. And so the big question we ask is, well, why didn't they just apply it to the whole thing at that point and saved us all the aggravation that we face today? There were a number of reasons for it at that point.
Well, I think that's the confusing thing, certainly from my perspective, and I think in the eyes of many people, is Israel took back control in a defensive war in 1967. if Israel, if Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, really was part of Israel or was intended to be, why did Israel not immediately apply or claim sovereignty to that whole area in 1967 after the Six-Day War?
Well, I think one of the main reasons for that is something that is important to understand about Israel, that unfortunately is not the case, or actually, fortunately for the other countries, it is not the case in other countries. Israel, maybe because we're a new country, maybe because we are coming off centuries of anti-Semitism, Israel is particularly sensitive to international pressure. Israel very often feels very vulnerable and feels that we need to have at least some level of international support or approval. And especially, and I think here the Arabs have done a very, very good job of eroding basic support for Israel's right to exist. But that was there also from the beginning. The very fact of the Arab attack against Israel on the day that it became a state, they have been fighting against our very existence from the beginning. And so that has created a certain kind of, I don't know, persecution complex or whatever on the part of Israel. So after the Six-Day War, you immediately have this enormous chorus of voices from all over the United Nations, from all over the world, saying, oh, Israel, you have to immediately withdraw. Now, that's unheard of. When is the last time a country was attacked? They responded to that attack, and then everyone says you've got to back down and give the land back to the aggressor. It makes no sense. But Israel, being as sensitive to that criticism, hesitated. Jerusalem, there was no hesitation, because Jerusalem is just, well, it's Jerusalem. That's the heart and soul of Israel and of our yearnings to return to the land. But the rest was seen as well, okay, maybe this is a place where we can compromise. And this issue of compromise was also present from the beginning, because Israel always sought, well, can we have a state that everyone will recognize? Well, if that means that no war, and in exchange for, giving the Arabs something, okay. Was that wise? Sometimes it was, not always. It's easy in hindsight to say, oh, in 1967, we should have just annexed everything. It would have been easier. But I'm not sure that they had that wisdom then, because they couldn't see forward. At that time, we had just had this first victory. Would we repeat itself? Will we continue to grow? Who knows?
Yeah, right. So then you had the Yom Kippur War, only 6 years later in 1973, that Israel narrowly survived, I think. Was there a change of opinion after that, do you think, within Israel about this whole issue? Do you think that there are more people in Israel who would like to apply sovereignty over these territories because they see, or they saw then, that the Arab world was not going to give up?
Well, I think the Yom Kippur War had its own effect at that time, but I certainly don't think that anyone then was talking about sovereignty. One of the issues also that prevented even people who wanted to settle in Judea and Samaria, prevented them from moving all the way forward to the sovereignty solution, was a fear of this huge demographic of the Arabs who actually lived in Judea and Samaria, who had settled in there, while we weren't around, and that's seen as a threat. So if anything, the Yom Kippur War heightened that sense of threat. If we thought that our victory in the Six-Day War would bring our Arab neighbors to recognize us as a fact, that they just have to come to terms with this, the Yom Kippur War dashed that. So we saw ourselves as forever, at war with the Arabs, and that certainly was a real problem. Recent years is really what has moved us towards sovereignty, and a couple of things have happened. One of which is that we've already given up a lot of land in Judea and Samaria, and we gave up all of Gaza to the Palestinians, and there is a Palestinian Authority, and they have a lot of control of many areas in Judea and Samaria. And that was done because there were governments who felt that that would bring us closer to peace if we go the route of compromise. And what has happened since then is that Israel even many people who used to be on the left, today the majority of Israelis are right-wing. And they see that this sort of compromise has only damaged, caused harm, terrorism, etc. And in fact, and this really brings us to the new Uae Agreement now. Today, and this has really been an approach that Netanyahu has led, and he has basically said, we are going to get nowhere with our Arab neighbors if we come from a position of weakness. However, if we come from a position of strength, that we as a nation of Israel have something to offer. Not that we are going to withdraw from territory, that's a position of weakness. But if we come to the Middle East in a position of strength, we are a successful country. We are leaders in technology. We are leaders in agriculture. We can give something to Arab countries that want to be at peace with us. That will be the biggest propellant towards peace. And indeed, that is what we're seeing today. And so a lot of this discussion as to, yes, withdraw, not withdraw, a lot of that has been muted for two different reasons. One is that more and more Israelis see that our compromises just brought greater terrorism. And on the other hand, they saw greater strength. Standing up for what is ours is what indeed has brought these Arab countries closer to real economic and peaceful relations.
Right. So do you see the Arab nations backing off their, traditionally they've stood behind the Palestinian cause, haven't they? The Palestinians have a right to a state in all of the West Bank. Do you think they're backing off from that now?
Well, I think one of the things that's changed that equation is Iran and the growth of Iranian and Shiite-supported terrorist groups. This new crescent, let's say, from Iran, Syria, Lebanon, Hezbollah, etc., and Turkey now, and then includes as well the Hamas. Even though Hamas is Sunni, they have also coming in under that same umbrella because they are so extremist and supporting of terrorism against Israel. And the West in general, not just against Israel. And so all of a sudden you have countries that are more moderate, like Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and Egypt, who are saying, wait, we don't have to worry about Israel. We do have to worry about Iran, and Israel can be an important ally in this cause. And so that's changed everything, I think, from their point of view. I think also they never liked the Palestinians. If they really liked the Palestinians and they really cared about them, for example, all those Palestinians that have been sitting in Jordan, they've been sitting in Lebanon, they've been sitting in Syria, they've been sitting in all these Arab countries, they would have been offered citizenship and full rights in those countries, and they're not. If they really cared so much about Palestinians, they could have, Egypt, for example, has the whole Sinai Desert that they don't even use. It's like a vastly underdeveloped region. They could have said, okay, let's make a Palestinian state in Sinai. There's so much that these Arab countries could have done for these Arabs, Palestinian Arabs, if they cared about them, but they don't. And they only use the Palestinian issue as a way to weaken Israel. And now all of a sudden they realize that it is not in their interest to weaken Israel. It is their interest to ally themselves with Israel to fight against the common enemy. And so it's not like they've abandoned the Palestinians. They never cared about them to begin with, but they see more and more that the Palestinians, instead of becoming an advantage to them, they become a dead weight. And while they will probably have a hard time saying this publicly, because meanwhile, all these years they've convinced their own people that standing as a good Muslim means standing in solidarity with our Palestinian brothers. Well, you can't overturn that overnight because your people in the streets are not going to be happy. But meanwhile, in the halls of government, they are turning their backs on that doctrine.
Right. So in terms of the relationship with the Palestinians, where do you see all of this heading? I mean, we're in a kind of a messy situation in the sense that you have Palestinian Authority on the ground that's evolved out of the Oslo process. You can't turn that back, I imagine. You can't completely, disband the PA. Is the only solution for peace a kind of a two-state solution, or what are the options?
All right, I think first of all, one of the mistakes that have been made over the decades, those people who tried to tackle this issue, was that they looked for a solution now, today, immediately. That will never happen. We have to go towards some kind of staged situation. And I think we tried the state situation that leads to a Palestinian state and found that it was a dismal failure, and we just have to get rid of it. It can no longer be an option. What we are hearing today more and more than, which is relatively new, is Palestinian Arabs themselves who are saying, we don't want a Palestinian state. We want to be part of Israel. And in fact, one of the things that I find particularly ironic, when Trump first announced his plan at the beginning of the year, that plan included a possibility that heavily populated Arab areas of Israel would become part of this Palestinian state. And the biggest opponents to that were the Israeli Arabs themselves. Now, these are the very same people that say, we stand with our Palestinian brothers and we want a Palestinian state. Now, does it make any sense you want a Palestinian state so long as you don't have to live in it? So how good can this Palestinian state be for those Palestinians if all these Israeli Arabs would rather be Israeli citizens? And so I think it's clear that it is better not only for the Jews but also for the Arabs if Israel is ultimately in control of the entire area. However, one of the options may be to have some kind of autonomy within this Israeli one state, have some kind of autonomy where they would be able to recognize their own cultural, religious, etc., have that kind of autonomy, but we have to be able to control land use, security issues, water use, all these things that really affect both peoples because they are just not responsible, and they've never been responsible on these issues. And they've been corrupt, terribly corrupt. And the Arabs know it, which is why they want Israel. It's not an ideological issue, it's a practical issue. They know their lives will be better under Israel. And so I think, we have to, there's a lot of details that, of course, need to be worked out. But I do believe that the Trump vision encompasses that vision. Because if you look and see, even though that vision uses the word Palestinian state, if you look and see how that state is defined and the criteria for establishing it, this is not a state. No, a state that cannot control its own borders, that cannot control its own airspace, is not a state. It is an autonomy. And I think they just use the word state in order to make the Arab side feel better, but that's not a state.
Right. So you're living in the communities, you're living in Samaria. Do you have contact with Palestinians, and do you have a sense of, the Palestinians on the ground? Is there a difference between the ordinary Palestinians and the Palestinian leadership, for example?
I don't have day-to-day contact with Palestinians, but there are a lot of Palestinian Arabs who come into the community and work, and there's relationships like that. They've come in, they especially building. I have 2 children who recently finished building homes here in our community, and they had daily contact with contractors and the Arabs who actually did the work. And those relationships are good relationships, and they're trusting relationships. You sign a contract with a Palestinian to build your home, and you're giving him money. That's a relationship of trust. Yeah. On the other hand, it's very rarely that there are actual political discussions that go on in that context. But it's clear that they want to be able to continue working in Israel and Israeli communities in Judea and Samaria. And I've had actually frank conversations with a few people that have made that very clear, that they don't put any faith in their own leadership and believe that they will have a much better life the more interaction they can have with Jews in Israel.
Right. So what you really see a potential possibility of Jews and Arabs in living side by side, cooperating, living in a peaceful coexistence? Or do you think?
Depends who. In other words, our biggest challenge is figuring out who's who. Because there are terrorists. They're really bad guys living there. And I can tell you that from my conversations with Palestinians, our way of looking at things, in other words, if you knew your neighbor was a murderer, you wouldn't want to have him living there. You would do everything you could to get rid of him, to turn him into the authorities, to have him, I don't know, boycotted from the community, because you have a moral stance. It's not just that you're nervous about your safety, but you are saying murderers don't belong among us. They're not like that. They don't have that same way of looking at things. In other words, they'll say, oh, the crazies, yeah, there's always some crazies. What can you do? And our expectation is that you recognize that murder is wrong, that you say that you come out and make a moral statement. They don't see it that way. So it's very difficult. It's not just about whose side are they on. They don't have that same moral compass that we have. Not that they're bad people, but they look at it differently. And so that's the challenge, knowing who you want to have as your neighbor and who you don't. And so for practical reasons, I don't envision a situation where Israel would ever not be in control of this whole area, because we need our own army, our own security forces to ensure that the bad guys don't take over.
Right. Well, turning it around the other way, I mean, there is a kind of a perception out there, I think, that the settlements are aggravating all of this. If it weren't for the settlements, if it weren't for Israelis going to live in these areas, we wouldn't have this problem. So the logic is remove the settlements, you're going to get rid of Palestinian terrorism, and then you can live happily ever after side by side. What's the problem with that analysis?
Problem is we live in the Middle East, and there's a lot of Arab terrorists and jihadists and extremists and those who allow that kind of activity to continue that surrounds us everywhere. What Jews living in Judea and Samaria has done is moved the terrorism here. We lived in Gaza. I didn't, but there were Jewish communities in Gaza. And throughout that time, especially the last few years, those Jewish communities were bombarded on a regular basis from Arabs living in Gaza. And when the Jews left Gaza, let's follow this logic. The Jews left Gaza completely. There's not a single Israeli civilian except those who are still being held prisoner without any rights. There are no Israeli civilians, there are no Israeli security personnel, no army, nothing in Gaza. So clearly we did with Gaza what people want us to do with Judea and Samaria. And rather than solve the problem, it just brought the terrorism into the center of Israel. So that now, instead of sending those rockets into the Jewish communities which are in Gaza, they're sending rockets into the Negev. And of course, we're seeing just, in this past week or so, how many of these incendiary balloons are sent over, and fields, acres and acres of crops are being burnt. And, it's a miracle that homes have not been hit so far in the same way. So, of course, we've had missiles, we've had rockets, we've had all kinds of things. So we're not going to solve any problems by running away. That's for sure. Not to mention, it's just not the right thing to do.
Right. So basically what you're saying is it doesn't matter really, in a sense, where the border is. The problem Israel faces, there's always going to be terrorist activity attacking Israel. So withdrawing is not going to solve that problem.
Well, withdrawing is going to exacerbate it, because as we have seen, Israel gains when it presents a strong stand. And I am convinced, and this is actually one of the reasons that I am very disappointed that we have not seen the Israeli government apply sovereignty yet, and why I hope it will do so very soon. Because that in itself is a very strong statement that says, we are here and we're here to stay. This is not a temporary situation. For as long as we refrain from applying sovereignty, we open the door for the Arabs and others to say, oh, we just apply greater pressure, they will leave. And so therefore, all of these various peace agreements that required some kind of level of withdrawal on Israel's part just fed the bully, fed the terrorism. But if we cut that short and say, no more, it's over. There will be no more two-state solution. We are here to stay. We are applying sovereignty. This is our direction. Even if we only apply sovereignty to some parts of the area today, we are going in this direction. That will force the Arabs, those Arabs at least who want to figure out what their future is, to realize that avenue is blocked. Well, at least maybe we need to explore other avenues.
Right.
And that, in my opinion, will really bring us much closer to peace.
Right. And in terms of the Israeli politics at the moment, do you see the government doing this? And to what extent is it linked to the American elections and Trump? Put another way, is the reason that's off the table at the moment because of because this fits in with the American administration at the time, or do you think the government will go ahead at some point anyway with applying Israeli sovereignty in the territory?
Well, there's no question that the policy of Netanyahu and the government of Israel at this point is that they do not want to go forward with sovereignty without American backing. And I can understand and appreciate that, because Trump is the first international leader and the first American president who made it very clear, certainly through his Secretary of State and others, that they would recognize in Israel's application of sovereignty. And that's an opportunity we dare not miss. And if we applied sovereignty in a way that America did not approve, we could still do it, but then we would have a 100% chorus of voices from around the world against it. Whereas if we can have one powerful voice, the United States, in favor of it, that already changes things. I do believe that Netanyahu missed a golden opportunity. They should have done this months ago. Now we're very close to an election. I am not sure really what is happening, but our biggest fear is if Trump does not win the election. If he does, then I think I'm fairly confident that we will have opportunities to apply sovereignty after, once he wins the election, and he will continue then to be president for 4 years. My concern is if he does not win the election, then we missed it. I hope in any case, for Israel's sake, that we do find a way and a time to do this soon. But I think Netanyahu really made a serious strategic mistake by not applying sovereignty already.
Right. Thank you. And Sondra, can you just, as a last question, say something about the current situation in Israel with the politics? Is Israel heading for new elections?
Nobody in Israel wants new elections, but unfortunately the current government is absolutely not functioning. The various ministers from the various parties are constantly fighting with one another on issues that you would think have absolutely no political or ideological ramifications, like how do we deal with this current COVID emergency. They cannot agree on anything. It is really a non-functioning government, and it is tragic. I would hope that we could avoid elections, but I also hope that somewhere up there in the Knesset, they figure out how to get out of kindergarten and act like responsible leaders.
Okay. So let's hope that something happens. Because what's the way of getting through this this crisis?
Well, I mean, nobody wants elections. So when there was supposedly, there would have been forced elections if they didn't pass the budget, because the law of Israel says if you don't pass the budget within 100 days of forming a government, then the government automatically falls. But then the Knesset changed the law. So, there's, members of Knesset can always do things to artificially keep a government alive. It's tragic. It really is. The system has to change. Everything has to change. Thank God there are wonderful people in Israel, and I have confidence in the people of Israel, because I certainly don't have very much confidence in the government of Israel right now.
Okay. Well, all the best, Sondra, and thank you so much for
Thank you, Andrew.
being with us today. Okay. Cheers.